Can I get some silence? Good. There's a lot of people here, so I think we will need a bit of silence when someone is speaking so that everyone can hear, even though hopefully this sound is very good. Thank you everyone for coming. Thanks especially to our guest speakers. From here in Finland, Mikko Kiesiläinen. An economist and the director of Liberal think tank. And also Juhana Vartiainen. Also an economist and a member of the parliament for the National Coalition. And also we have two international guests here. Matt Bruenig. He's the founder of the People's Policy Project think tank from the US. And here we have Bhaskar Sunkara. The founder and editor of Jacobin magazine. Before the debates, which I think most of you are here to listen to and hear and maybe even comment and participate in a little bit, I will go through the agenda for tonight, and then after that we will have a small introduction by Matt Bruenig. So, at the first debate there will be Bhaskar Sunkara and Mikko Kiesiläinen debating on the freedom and well-being in market-based systems versus state-provided systems, or if you will, socialist versus capitalist systems. In the second debate, we will have Juhana Vartiainen and Matt Bruenig debating on social well-being, equality, economic efficacy, and different welfare regimes. Both of these debates will be around 30 minutes, and we will have a few questions afterwards. The amount of questions will be according to how long people speak, so I will ask you to keep the questions short and hopefully also the answers short. And after both of these debates, we will have some time for final questions, general questions and comments on tonight's debate, as we won't have the conclusion that was on the agenda originally. But now, let's begin. Thank you all for coming again, and I'll give the floor to Matt Bruenig.
All right, so before we begin the debate, I wanted to kind of give a primer on US versus Nordic economies, since the US is sort of the epitome of market liberalization and the Nordics are kind of the epitome of a social democratic model. And so I kind of wanted to lay out the main differences between them as sort of I see it. So the three main institutional differences: Nordic countries have much higher union coverage, much higher social spending, and much higher state ownership. Here are the union coverage numbers. The US is actually probably going to be quite a bit lower than that after a recent Supreme Court ruling that made it harder for public sector workers to unionize. Public social spending as a percent of total consumption, as you can see, it's a little under double. I use total consumption here instead of GDP because of Norway's strange situation with the oil. Percent of national wealth owned by government, as you can see, straight down. Sweden, one notable thing, most of these countries don't have good figures running way back. Sweden does, and in 1976, the Swedish bar was at 43%, so it's come down a lot. But generally, during its social democratic heyday, it was really quite high. The result, the first result, low income inequality. We have smaller gaps between wage levels, smaller gaps in final disposable income, and lower poverty rates. So this is the ratio of 98th percentile earnings to 10th percentile earnings. So if you imagine, you know, the person at the 90th percentile of the wage ladder and the person at the 10th percentile, and you just kind of divide those. As you can see, the US, the gap is about twice as large, and normally this is attributed to solidaristic wage setting in the Nordic countries, which is done through the sectoral bargaining. Disposable income is the same sort of story. This is the difference here is still double, and mostly attributed to differences in social spending and welfare regimes. Also, of course, somewhat attributed to the solidaristic wage setting. And poverty rate, same sort of situation. And the poverty rate is especially compelling for children, where the US rate is 6 times the Finnish rate, and elderly people. Second result, the welfare state gives a better work-life balance, get more paid leave for new parents, more vacation, fewer work hours. Here's weeks of paid parental leave. The Finnish bar obviously includes the home child care allowance. The US has no guaranteed paid leave on the federal level. We have had a few states, such as California and I believe New Jersey, that have allowed around 12 weeks or sometimes 16 weeks. Weeks of guaranteed vacation, again, nothing in the US. Hours worked per worker, same sort of story, much more work per worker in the US. And this is, again, usually attributed to union bargaining, which has allowed work hours to come down, whereas in the US we don't have that sort of leverage in the labor market. And as a final result, given the debate we're about to have, I just wanted to include the fact that at least for as long as the OECD has been collecting these statistics, Nordic economies grow at least as fast as the US economy. In fact, if you sort of start in 1970, which is when the OECD data set starts, every Nordic country has grown faster than the US. Of course, the countries, Finland especially, were much poorer than the U.S. Starting in 1970. So some of that is perhaps catch-up growth, and you can't attribute that. But generally, we would say that the growth is going well, even though much higher social spending, much higher taxes, and those kinds of things. So that is, I think, like a good primer for framing the rest of the discussion.
Thank you, Matt Bruenig, for that introduction. Now we will go to the debates. We're on time, we're ahead of schedule, which is good because I think we will have a lot of questions afterwards. Let's go to the first debate, which is between Bhaskar Sunkara. Bhaskar, will you come here? And Mikko Kiesiläinen. I will give you an opportunity to... So now you may introduce yourselves shortly and maybe talk a bit what is your point of view tonight.
Should I start or? Yeah. Okay.
Yes, you may start.
Yeah, sure.
Excuse me.
Well, my name is Bhaskar Sunkara. I was born in New York. My parents had come to the U.S. just a year before I was born. So basically, I came to the left, to the far left. I'm not a social democrat, and to the left of social democracy. But I came through it sort of through an understanding and respect for the gains of the welfare state and certain things it was able to do quite well. So in other words, I was the youngest of 5 children. I was the only one born in the United States, so I had the chance to go to university. My siblings, three older siblings, did not. I kind of saw how much of life is an accident of birth, and how the difference for me was being in a town that had a very good public school and had access to social goods and whatnot. And it was only from that starting point that I started studying more deeply kind of the history of workers' movements, and eventually understanding some of the limits of social democracy made me into, in the US, what we would call democratic socialists, but in Europe would better correspond to kind of the, I don't know, the equivalent of the Euro-communist or left social democratic traditions. And yeah, besides that, I'm a editor and publisher of different magazines. The biggest one is Jacobin magazine, which is the largest socialist publication in the United States.
Hi, my name is Mikko Kiesiläinen, and I'm the director of the Libera think tank. Libera aims to promote several freedoms in Finnish society, mostly individual liberties, freedom of speech, free society, and free market economy. And my political aims are to basically advance the market mechanism to support the social welfare state in Finland. So I believe that my basic thesis is that we need a capitalist society which is able to provide us with the resources needed to finance the welfare society's benefits.
Thank you. This debate will focus on. Sorry, excuse me, I lost my track. This debate will focus on the role of the state, ownership, concepts of freedom and liberty, public versus market-based service, and market-led decision-making. As a reminder and remark to the audience here and also our speakers, but mostly audience, in the US the term liberal is often almost synonymous to leftist or progressive, whereas in Finland there's a distinction between economical liberalism and social liberalism. And tonight we will mostly speak about the economical liberalism. So if our speakers, debaters talk about liberalism, especially the ones from US, they mean economical liberalism. Just a clarification. But let's go to the questions, and I will let Mikko answer first, since Sunkara first introduced himself. How do you see the relationship between freedom or liberty and private ownership and capitalist market relations? Little question after this. What does free mean when talking about free market or free trade?
Yeah, well, basically my understanding of the capitalist and free market system is that a free private market is a mechanism for achieving voluntary cooperation among people. So basically it's a way to organize a complex society that produces complex products and goods that people want in a way that's basically organized bottom up. So people choose what they want. If you take a consumer, they have a certain want that they want, they communicate that to the retailer communicates that to the wholesale, and the wholesale communicates that to the producer. And that's where the production starts to happen. And the product ends from the producer to the wholesaler, then back to the retailer, and then to the consumer. But the demand starts from bottom up. And the opposite of this kind of basically free market mechanism is basically a socialist system where the organization goes from top to bottom. Basically an equivalent of the army, where the general tells the colonel what they want, the colonel tells the captain what to do, and then the captain tells the soldier what to do. So this is basically a very opposite idea of whether you want to organize things bottom up or from top down. And I'm advocating from the bottom up because it actually increases the amount of liberty that the society has. It gives restraints power that can be imposed on people. It gives freedom of choice to the people.
Thank you.
So, well, I would say fundamentally, much of my colleagues' answer here revolved around the question of markets for consumer goods. So in other words, the kind of price mechanisms and how consumers, through their purchasing decisions on a market, can show their preferences and whatnot. And I'm not in favor of central planning. I think there's issues with both economic calculation, kind of figuring out prices and whatnot, and there's also potentially even incentive issues. So I wouldn't disagree there. For me, the question of the reason why I think that capitalism erodes freedom rests not with our actions as consumers, but rather with relationships at the point of production. So in other words, workers certainly agree voluntarily to enter into an employment relationship in a capitalist society, but they do so under a bargain that in its most pure form is a work or starve contract. And work or starve, I think, is a contract made under duress. So what socialists propose is giving workers both voice within the workplace, so in other words, union representation, a bedrock of rights, setting limits, in other words, to what the employer can do in this employment relationship, but also exit from this relationship. So in the United States, for example, even though I legally could leave my employment, it's a lot harder for me to exit because I don't have a bedrock of decommodified social goods. And I also don't have, often there's conditions of higher employment. There's not kind of a larger state sector to potentially absorb me or whatnot. So if I'm in a tough situation at work, I might just grit my teeth and say, this is the only job I have. So for me, true freedom for the worker means giving them the exit or the chance to leave. And often they might not even choose to leave, but even that bargaining power gives them the chance to exert their interests and their rights over that of the boss. And I think in general you could take this logic further and say, what would be a truly free workplace? And to me, certain things we might have to deal with. Divisions of labor, for example, might always exist in any modern, complex industrial society. But I can imagine a system in which workers are able to control their own enterprises, elect management, and kind of collectively decides their terms of employment. But for me, the main issue of unfreedom for capitalism is this worker-starve bargain, which I don't think is a fair bargain at the point of production.
Do you wish to respond, Mikko?
Yeah, actually, I think the question of how to answer this kind of bargaining situation, and if the capitalist system results in a situation where the individual worker has not enough power in the bargain, I think that's a task for the society to improve the bargaining position of the worker. And I think this is the best way to do this is by giving some kind of basic income to the worker, so they have a some kind of fallback option, and so that they can choose, as you also mentioned, that in the end of the day, the entering of employment contract is a voluntary choice. Now it's just a question, how do we make that bargaining position better? And I think the basic income or some kind of social security system that the Scandinavian models do have is the best way of doing and achieving that.
Well, the only very quick... sorry.
Go ahead, Bhaskar.
So the only quick caveat I would add to that is that it's not society that decided these things in a very technocratic, way. Social democracy was foisted upon capitalists by the actions of large, mobilized worker movements. And the logic of these movements, their systematic expansion of their rights, the expansion of they're demanding a bigger and bigger share of market resources, eventually made the situation, the systems largely unsustainable. So Sweden as a society didn't decide in the last 20, 30 years ago, oh, we're going to roll back our welfare state because we used to have this mentality, but now we have a different mentality. But in fact, the profitability was eroded of Swedish capitalists by these demands. So I think that we can't accept at face value the idea that there's an option that just creates infinite amounts of bargaining power for workers, but also creates the underlying profitability that you need for your worldview. I think at some point you have to choose one or the other. In other words, I think that freedom for capitalists and freedom for workers is essentially a zero-sum game. Wealth is not in a capitalist society, wealth creation, but this freedom and rights are.
Let's move on to the next question, although I'm sure you both have many things to add and remark to each other. Do you believe that the privatization of public functions, proliferation of capitalist relations, and expanding private ownership rather increase or decrease the average person's experienced degree of freedom and liberty, and why? And this time Bhaskar starts.
Well, I think that in many cases we should say that we shouldn't equate just one-to-one state ownership and state control with, I think, a socialist model. I think they often do correlate, but sometimes not. For example, at its peak, the United Kingdom had a higher percentage, I believe, of state ownership and a larger number of state enterprises under their sort of labor system than Sweden did. And actually, apologies, but I've really only studied the Nordic model in the Swedish and Norwegian contexts, so you'll have to excuse my constant references. So I think it's not always a one-to-one thing. So I can imagine, in other words, struggles to make state services and state bureaucracies more accessible, more accountable, more efficient. And the bureaucratic kind of gray of the welfare state in many ways it shouldn't be our highest aspiration. But as a whole, these having social goods under the care of the state has put these things in the political sphere. So has allowed us to kind of make these access to these things a right, and making it dependent on the ability to pay, which any privatization scheme would erode those rights. But I think even you would agree that there's a bedrock of things that shouldn't be touched by the private market.
Yeah, and I think it comes to the level at which the individual society works at. And I think in the Finnish case and the Scandinavian case in general, I think there's a strong case to be made that the government should have a smaller role in the economic sphere. And for example, the Finnish government owns fossil fuel electric production. And there's a very good question of why on earth the Finnish government should own fossil fueled electric production. And I think that currently hinders also the fight against climate change, because the government is afraid to touch this peat or turve production because it is government owned and there's a lot of jobs involved in there. So basically they're afraid of the political backlash of losing those jobs if they actually just, decided to tackle this part of the fossil fuel production. And similarly, last week, the German auto industry warned that a lot of jobs could be lost if the electric vehicles take up a market share from gasoline-fueled cars. And I think if the German auto industry was government-owned, I think this would actually cause a significant hindrance to the proliferation of electric vehicles. So I think in many kind of political, when the consideration for jobs comes into consideration into other political goals that you want to achieve, like fight against climate change, then you start to have a mixed goals, and typically those the political ambition to save jobs usually comes at a very high level of interest for the politicians. And for that reason, for example, I think it would be much simpler for the government to regulate industries rather than to kind of also have a stake as an owner or an economic actor in running or managing these companies. And also, when you look at the companies which are involved in producing services that are funded by the government, I think also, for example, the healthcare sector, it could be significantly improvement for the productivity if there was competition also from private companies in certain cases. So if they show that a private company can operate certain kind of medical operations more efficiently than the public sector, I don't see any reason why the public sector couldn't buy these services from the private producers.
So, I mean, sorry, I can respond.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, I think that the core of your argument just there was that if these companies were state-owned, like, for example, the fossil fuel extraction companies, state-owned companies are subjected to more immediate political pressures. I don't see how this would be any different if you're now adding in a group of capitalists that join their workers and also having, an interest. So I think at best it's kind of a neutral thing. There would still be pressure from the sectors to maintain employment, and now you're also creating a layer of people whose income and wealth is dependent on distribution. So I don't see the difference there. I would say just in general, while we're on the topic of climate change, what we're finding now is that the short-term profit-making incentives of capital is preventing capitalists from maybe even making medium and long-term decisions. So maybe be in the collective interest of not just the planet, but let's say the capitalist class as a whole. Because let's say if I'm a high-minded capitalist and I own a firm that's producing automobiles, and I think that I'm aware of the science, and I think that in the medium or long term this is going to be disastrous for the planet and thus for my industry. I wouldn't make the leap and change what I'm doing in the short term necessarily, because I'll be put at a tremendous disadvantage compared to my other market competitors. By the time that any of my medium or long term investments paid off, I'd be undercut, my market share would dissipate. That's why you precisely need the state, even if just to support research and development and to shelter certain industries, and especially in the era of climate change, I think you need state incentives and state involvement. So I think this would be precisely the most disastrous time to be pulling out of certain extractive spheres. And the last thing I would say, just in regards to healthcare, I think in the United States we're living in a hellish nightmare for 30 to 40 million Americans that have no idea what's going to happen if they have an accident at work and have to go on long-term health benefit. There's millions of bankruptcies every year over it. So even if I was to concede, which I'm not necessarily doing, but if I were to concede that there's a couple outpatient services or let's say things like that, the private sector could be more nimbly than the state sector, you also have to factor in the political aspect of now creating a layer of capitalists who get their money off privatized health services, something that I think we would all agree in the room is a social right and that shouldn't be dependent on your ability to pay. So the political aspects of these kind of shifts isn't just a technocratic question of what's the most efficient thing to do. You have to also think about what actors are you empowering and what direction is this going to go, and how do you protect a welfare state. So what you're proposing seems to be a modernization of aspects of the welfare state. It's my argument that it would lead to the entire erosion of the welfare state.
I honestly don't think that they would lead to the erosion. Just like for example, food, you need something that everybody needs. But I think I definitely think that the food production is best organized by this kind of bottom-up demand of what people want, and then they tell the retailer and they tell the producer. And I don't think it would make any sense that to say that just because this kind of food is a necessary thing to live, it could not be guided by the profit motive, and if the purchases of food are funded by the government or the private individual, it doesn't really matter with who pays the bill. It's still, it's not, the production of food is not eroded in any significant way. And touching on the climate change, we both agree that state involvement is needed. I think that's a perfect example of a situation where you can see that the market mechanism is the best way to efficiently target the resources you want to allocate for climate change, combating climate change. When you actually create a price for the carbon emissions and put that price high enough, then the market will find the most efficient ways of reducing carbon emissions. And I think it would be the best if the government just focused on putting the price that is really high enough to place the real price on of the carbon emissions of the producers, instead of trying to kind of provide subsidies to wind electricity or other clean energy. I think it would be much more efficient to actually let the market decide which is more efficient. Is it solar, is it wind, or is it nuclear?
Well, I mean, the last thing I would say is that, yeah, I actually am for a carbon tax, and I think that a lot of those market mechanisms would work. And also, I am I'll just say I am in favor of nuclear power as part of a transition.
Me too.
And that's very unpopular on the European left in general. But I figured I would let that slip. But when it comes to food and medicine, I mean, it's not just an abstract discussion. I mean, we've seen examples of massive state intervention as far as fixing prices and being involved with food productions, and it's been a disaster, right? So we could say, all right, let's look at that empirically. We've also seen cases of incorporating the private sector in the delivery of medicine, and that's also been a disaster, and it's created an incredible amount of inefficiency, untimely deaths, and so on. The U.S. system is more bloated, more bureaucratic, and more expensive than any other public system. So you know, it's not a abstract question. I think we can look empirically at these things.
I think in both cases, whether it's food or medicine, you need some kind of a gatekeeper role for the government, just to kind of considering food safety standards. Those are set typically by the government, and in the same way, there's a certain asymmetry of information on the medicine. So obviously, on healthcare, you need some kind of a gatekeeper role for the government. But once that's kind of checked and decided what are the health medicines or the treatments that are needed, then I don't think it would erode the system in any significant way if it was produced in the end by a private company or by public civil servants.
Okay, let's go to the next question, but I'm happy that you're debating lively. How would you define an optimal balance between public and private? In other words, what should be taken care of by the state or public sector in general, and what should be left to the market? Explain. And Mikko, you may start.
That's a very broad question, yes. But I'd say that I don't think it's for any individual to say that, okay, there's a clearly defined optimal level that could be reached, and now the world is perfect when we reach that point. I'm more in favor of saying that what is the direction that we need to move towards. And I think in the Finnish case, there is the direction we should move to is for less state involvement in quite a lot of sectors, especially the economic sphere, but also in terms of certain services as well.
Yeah, my answer is straightforward because I do believe in state ownership of the means of production in the old, to use the old language, but with a bedrock of worker control. So in other words, what I mean by that is, in my vision of socialism, the question would be, what sectors are decommodified and directly administered by the state, and what sectors are exposed to market competition? Only I believe that the market actors in this case should be worker-controlled firms who are running, you know, both goods and services, and are, you know, they're in market competition. There's still firm failure. Only the penalty for failure isn't going to be destitution, but rather kind of landing on the soft bedrock of the welfare state and getting retrained and going into a more dynamic sector. But ultimately, I believe that the ability of capital and capitalists to withhold investment threaten any project of reform within capitalism. So if you were telling me you could freeze the Nordic model in the mid-1970s, and you know, you could either, you know, like you're playing blackjack or something, you could either get another card and risk everything, you know, going away, or you could stay put. You know, I would probably stay put. Just because I think that was the you know, levels of humanity and decency that most of the world hasn't got a chance to experience. You know, the life of most people in the world is still kind of short and terrible and subject to all sorts of petty tyrannies. Luckily, those of us, even in the United States, you know, life is like that. So for me, the problem is that social democracy both strengthens the capabilities of workers, but it also leaves structural power in the hands of capitalists. So when the situation changes and capitalist power is eroded, and they can't deal with the inroads into profitability, into their profits, then they'll just roll back the system, or they'll threaten capital flight. like they did in France in the 1980s. Although there are all these other things that have undermined social democracy since the 1980s. So I think if we believe in social democracy, if we believe that it should be sustainable, we have to eventually go beyond social democracy, start asking questions about how do you socialize the investment function. And I think worker-controlled firms in a market socialist, for lack of a better word, economy would be one solution to that dilemma. You know, the Swedes experimented with the Meidner plan and with various attempts to socialize production. There would have been one resolution to the crisis in the 1970s. The attempts by third-way social democrats and others who wanted to kind of retreat, but kind of in a coordinated retreat from some aspects of the welfare state, is one solution to the problem. One that I find less morally desirable. But you know, staying put isn't an option.
Well, what exactly do you mean by the aiming of socializing the investment decision? And you also mentioned that the ownership of a means of production should be, if I understood correctly, to be socialized, to a limited extent or overall.
Overall.
But then you also may aim that you want to have like a competitive markets.
So in other words, I mean, this is probably too. Oh, first of all, I will acknowledge this important caveat, which is it is much easier to describe and talk about a system that only exists in the abstract than to deal with the real flaws of a system that actually exists. But in my vision of socialism, which draws on people like David Schweizkart, who wrote this book After Capitalism, and a host of other thinkers, would be to propose that workers can band together and write business plans and get money from state-funded banks to start new industries. But essentially, when I think about the useful things that a capitalist does, I don't think capitalists are parasites. You know, that's just rhetoric that people use. Capitalists do two useful things. One is they perform some managerial function at their workplaces, most capitalists. Two, they provide entrepreneurial risk, right? They're taking a risk when they start new enterprises. So my question is, what can workers replicate those functions? And I think that it's obvious that workers can elect their own management. You could even look at existing co-determination agreements and just extend them further, and I think you would even admit that would be possible. The question is, can workers replicate that entrepreneurial risk? You know, can they do that? And I think with the help of alternative forms of financing, they could. But part of this is an ideological thing. You know, I am morally opposed, morally and ethically, to exploitation and domination of person by person. So I think that the wage-labor relation is morally untenable. So I'm seeking ways in which we could keep positive aspects of market competition while eroding the subordination of person to person that I see in the wage-labor relationship. I'm not pretending that this is just a technocratic argument. I believe that it could be done at relatively the same efficiency, if not perhaps more efficient than capitalist production. I don't know that, but I think that that's a starting point. You know, to be a socialist is fundamentally a moral and ethical decision.
Just saying that short comments, and we'll move on to the next question.
I just want to quickly comment that I think you are actually dreaming of the capitalist dream. Basically, at the moment, the workers can join together and draw up a business plan and go to a bank to get financing. If it's a good plan, they'll get financing. That's the beauty of capitalism. They can actually start their own company and compete with their employer. They can also elect their own management, and if it's a good management that they elect, they'll get a good company running. That's the freedom of enterprise. And when you say about basically socializing the decision of investment, then that's basically on a kind of society level. And you complain that the issue with the capitalist system is that there's a company and the CEO of the company gets too much say, basically deciding what the company does. This individual firm is basically an island of planned economy within the free market economy, and it competes with different units of planned economy. Now, if you decide to take the investment decision on the society level, then you're basically taking up the same issues that you have with individual firms to the level of the whole society. And I think that just compounds the problems that you can have in the capitalist system.
Well, I think, first of all, when it comes to the question of workers, of course they have the ability to exit today, potentially, and start small businesses. But the question is collective exit. So in other words, if me and you were to leave our joint enterprise, and since we're getting along so well, we decide to start a business together, if this business is going to succeed, it's going to be on the bedrock of employing other people in the wage-labor relation. So we exited the relation as individual, but not collectively. And I think the argument just has to be that if we believe that democracy is a good thing, in every other sphere of life, we believe democracy is a good thing in the voting booth, then why isn't it a good thing from 9 to 5? Why do we cede our rights 9 to 5? Now, when it comes to, like I said, a division of labor, I think will always be necessary. So when it comes to authority, certain authorities, we see and we can justify. In other words, if you have a small child, your authority over that small child is probably justified because that child can't take care of itself. But there's limits to that exploitation, right? There's limit to that relationship. It's not exploitative. You can't beat your child. You can't do certain things. I think that a manager's function at a workplace would be subject to the same kind of decision making. In other words, when you elect a management, it would be on kind of a Republican basis. In other words, a manager might still do something you hate at a worker-owned firm, but the question is, where does this manager derive its power? The manager derives its power through an election or through XYZ qualifications, and that's a justification. So I think exposing them, having a more democratic society, which was the original meaning of social democracy, the extension of democracy from just the political sphere into economic and social spheres, means asking these questions. And I think these questions are questions that the capitalist system can't really accommodate.
Yes, let's move on to the next question. How should we address so-called market failures? I mean things like global warming and rapid loss of biodiversity that call for massive and urgent changes in the way we produce, commute, consume and live. How could the market be used to deliver this change?
I think to some extent we actually touched upon that topic, already. And,
yes, you did. Yeah. But you may broaden the answers a bit further. Bhaskar, you may start.
I think that it's possible. In other words, people like to say, and I think it's a rhetorical thing. Socialists often like to say, we can't solve this crisis within capitalism. I actually have a kind of like Evernote, like the application. I keep clippings of various things that I discover when I'm looking through archives or whatnot. And the common, Trotskyist claim in the 70s and 80s with relation to South Africa is South African capitalism cannot survive without apartheid. Because basically, this common trick is often people saying, this thing is morally bad and reprehensible. I also dislike this thing. Let's connect them together and say they're inseparable. I think things could be bad, but in general, separate. And I think that the challenges of global warming could, in fact, be addressed within capitalism. But it's going to require movements pushing for a kind of almost developmental state approach to have both carrots and sticks to private enterprises to make them do certain things that they might not want to do in the short term, and potentially give them subsidies to make it easier for them to do it, but also have the stick, the whip of coercion. If you just have the carrot, you don't have a stick, then you end up with Nehruvian developmental state, like in India, where you have inefficient, bureaucratic, bloated, reliant on state subsidies. If you have the carrot and stick working correctly, then you might be able to enact a transition quick enough to stave off the worst effects of global warming. But even when it comes to dealing with the effects of the warming that we will have, as far as the creation of dikes and potentially moving people away from certain low-lying areas and things like that, I think we both agree that's a place that the state should be actively involved in.
And combining with the previous discussion that we just had on the kind of worker management type of thing, I think that the best way of getting companies to respond to different kind of situation is the price mechanism. And in a situation where the company would be ready to kind of respond to the prices and the profit information that the company has, now if you have a situation where the employees of the company vote in the management, then you start to have very mixed situations where you have the management would realize that with the current prices we can't sustain the operation that we have, but then the people who they are in a managerial relationship with, they say actually we want to keep our jobs, we don't want to switch to do something completely different. Then you have this kind of conflict of interest, and I don't see how this kind of a company which would have a employee elected leadership could respond in any kind of coherent way to this kind of conflict of interest.
Do you wish to comment?
Well, I mean, I think the whole point of any sort of worker control like this is that the workers would own shares in their company instead of a traditional wage relationship and get a percentage of the dividends adhering to, you know, certain minimum standards. So I think they would have every incentive to keep their companies adaptive to new environments. And, you know, you could even look at the height of bourgeois firms to see how it might work if you might have to do layoffs or reduce hours. You know, when someone's an equity partner at a law firm, let's say, and a law firm's doing redundancy, you know, they're given a certain share on the way out, or their stocks are liquidated, and, you know, in this case, it would help them with the transition. But yeah, so I don't see the contradiction there.
Do you wish to comment?
Well, in the case which you have a situation that the person with a private wealth would also be tied with their employer, I think that just compounds the risk for the individual. If you have basically your wage income and ownership of kind of a savings tied up, then you have a risk of a complete blowout, like you had with the case of Enron, for example, that most of the employees of the companies, they were also owners of the company through their pension plan, and when the company went bankrupt, they lost both their job and their savings.
Yeah, actually, I think this might be a perk, not a negative thing. So in other words, to be even more market than the market here, you know, the incentives in a society like this would in fact mean that there'd be greater rewards for the success of a firm. There might be greater penalties for failure, just in terms of you know, yeah, you go bankrupt. You're making X wage before. You're not earning it anymore. There's risk, but it's all cushioned on the fact that most of the basics of life are provided for in a decommodified welfare state. So in other words, firm failure potentially can be a good thing. Actually, I don't think you could have socialism without profit or firm failure, as far as we know. I think it might be different in the future. I think computing advances may mean the calculation problem I mentioned earlier might be solved in the future. You know, we might have less necessary labor hours because of technological advances or whatnot. You know, but yeah, I think the risk of failure and people having an incentive to make their firms work is part of the reason why I think some type of market socialism would in fact work.
Yes, I think it's time for the questions from the audience. Do we have any? At least we have one from the back.
Hi, I'm Ari Slior from Suomen Talousdemokratia ry or Economic Democracy, Finland. And yeah, I would have so much to say, and I'm trying to pick something that's the most important thing. Well, I think that when Mikko talked about this conflict of interest if you have a state-owned company, I think that's an interesting question, especially if you think about something that's produced by a company and then it's paid for by the government. I think you have potential huge problems there, because when the government is paying it, for example in the case of healthcare, but then the consumer of that service is not within the government, so then you would have to have huge regulation in order to ensure. And even I don't know what you mean by efficiency in healthcare, but anyway, so because the people who are using the healthcare system cannot really, you know, if the government pays for it, they can't like vote with their wallet. the consumers, I mean, in that case. So then the state is pouring money into it, but you know, consumers might be suffering because they can't really vote with their wallet and change where they want to go or something. Like on a systemic level, I don't mean like within one company or something, but on a systemic level. So I think that's something that's really interesting to hear what you think about. And then also a comment to Mikko is that I think you're dreaming the market dream in a way. So I probably would agree with you on many things, except that I think that in the capitalist system that we have now, the capitalists have so much political control that there's a conflict of interest between, let's say, the owners of the company, that they want to get profits, and then because the government is kind of dependent on those companies, and we have free markets or free capital movement globally. So if the government tries to regulate somewhere, the investor might decide, okay, we're not getting profits here, we move to another country. So I mean, I think it's a beautiful idea, but how could you politically, in a global world, kind of put that into practice? And there's actually an excellent book by Danny Roderick, The Globalization Paradox, and the sub kind of title is Why Free Markets, States and Democracy Cannot Coexist. There's a dilemma, or trilemma there.
Thank you. Do you wish to answer?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, starting with efficiency in healthcare, I can assure you there's tons and tons of literature, academic literature on defining, which is easily defined health efficiency in healthcare. I think that's a really major question. Can you define that? In terms of like the services.
How would you define it?
Well, that's not my job to define it. In terms of like services provided by the government, in most cases, things paid by the government. I mean, government buys a lot of things provided by private companies. They buy auto cars for the police force. They buy uniforms from private companies. And there is a couple of exceptions to situations where the government buys something, but somebody else consumes it. And I think it is in general would be a good advice that in cases where somebody else consumes the service or product being bought, it would be best that they get to choose which one it is. So basically, if there is something that the government is paying but somebody else is getting, I would also hand over the choice of the producer to the consumer in that situation, basically giving the market power to the consumer, even though the end bill is being paid by somebody else. Now, healthcare is the slightly different exception in this case because of the asymmetry of information, that you can't really know whether what kind of, it's difficult to know how much or what type of healthcare is being needed, and that's why I stressed previously that the gatekeeper role is needed to be held, has to be held by the government civil servants, so that they know what kind of services the government is actually paying for and are they necessary. And what comes to the political power of the capitalists, obviously the political power is always being pressured from all directions, and this is not unique to any political system. I think it applies to all of them. But in general, I think the best combination of what we need is that we need to have human freedom, political freedom, and economic freedom. And I'm in favor of all three of them. And I really struggle to see how can you have significant political and human freedom if the government takes economic freedom away from you.
Well, I think you can judge healthcare efficiency just on the basis of how much does it cost to treat people, how many people are getting treated, how fast is the treatment, you know, rates of re-entry. You know, there's all sorts of metrics that you could use in healthcare. And I think what we've found is that state-provided healthcare is more efficient. It's actually the one thing that even the old state socialist systems could actually do really well. You know, the state socialist kind of command economies failed at, let's say, nimble things you do with your regular fingers, but we're pretty good at repetitive tasks, like the things you do with your thumb, right? So mass vaccinations, providing preventative cares, establishing clinics even in rural areas where it might not be especially profitable to do so, providing some sort of level, you know, equality of care by training doctors at state, you know, schools and whatnot. I think, you know, even the old socialist models that I might not agree with on most other things did education and healthcare pretty well. As far as the feedback loop in capitalism versus other systems, I think the best way to look at it is at the level of, let's say under capitalism, it's not direct pressure, direct corruption in the sense that, like, often people on the center left interpret it as like a revolving door as the main issue. Like people who were in industry are kind of using their dollars to influence politics, or they're going straight from industry to politics or whatnot. But it's more just like a feedback loop. So in other words, if the welfare state is dependent on having capitalist, profitable capitalist firms, and the state coffers need to tax, productive, profitable capitalist industries, then if the government starts doing things that capital doesn't like, capital will threaten to withhold investment, and then the state managers, the next time there's a round, or legislators, the next time there's a round of legislation, will dial back. It's this kind of feedback loop. I think in a different sort of society, a socialist society, you could actually put in sync the demands of worker-controlled firms and the broader state sector. I don't actually think they would necessarily be in conflict in the same way.
Thank you. We will have one more question, and then we will have to move on to the next debate. I'm sorry, I know there are people who wish to ask questions, but after both of the debates, we will have more time for questions. But for now, we have to, after this question, move on to. You may ask your question.
Okay, I have two questions. Quick ones, just one for Bhaskar. You said you favor market socialism. But a typical kind of socialist critique of capitalism is that markets are anarchy. They lead to really inefficient resource allocation. So if you have socialism with markets, you're going to get inefficient allocation as well. And there's also a tendency for workers to start kind of exploiting themselves in their cooperatives. So the question is, really, to be a consistent socialist, wouldn't you have to actually replace market competition with forms of direct cooperation? So that's one question. The second question is for Mikko. I mean, from a liberal perspective, well, there's one thing liberals and socialists agree on. It's the principles of freedom and equality, right? The difference is socialists think that they're not actually realized in capitalism. So from a liberal perspective, capitalism is about efficient allocation of property. It's a system of equal exchanges between individuals who are free. But I mean, that seems to like hide the system's dirty little secret, which is that capitalism isn't really a system of property. It's a system of propertylessness. Most people in capitalism don't own property. So I mean, capitalism's dirty little secret is how most people actually don't own means of production. They don't have access to the basic means of living a good life. And that's what wage labor is. It's where you have nothing else to do but sell your labor to a capitalist for a wage. And I mean, that doesn't seem free. That doesn't seem equal. So if you're going to be a consistent liberal and follow your principles, doesn't that mean that you really have to be an anti-capitalist? Doesn't that mean that you're really a secret socialist if you want to be consistent?
I will shortly emphasize the short questions so we can move on.
So I guess on your last point reminds of, I'm blanking on the quote actually, who said the quote, but the law and its infinite equality forbids rich man and poor man alike from sleeping under bridges. And I think that gets at liberalism and its contradictions, where it can afford people certain rights but not the means to actually realize them. When it comes to markets, I think a lot of the criticism of markets in the past by socialists was on the grounds that that markets were inefficient, and then sort of some state planning could actually speed up development. And I think there was a lot seemingly to that argument in the places where socialists were running governments, particularly in the third world, where there seemed to be just a need for massive state development and whatnot. But I think we found that after maybe an initial period of catch-up, or after the social success in building things like heavy industry or basic goods that in the end, these systems became quite inefficient, particularly as it relates to the fact that there wasn't really firm failure, and these firms were often operating within soft budgets. So, for example, if I was running a state-managed firm in the Soviet Union, the one thing I knew is that I had to hit my quota, right? So I would request as much raw materials as possible, not necessarily just out of corruption or selling it on the black market or whatnot. I would do so just because I knew that you know, I needed all the raw materials I could get to hit my quota, and you know, near the end of my quota, the material might be inefficient or shoddy or whatnot. And what's going to happen? Who's ensuring quality control? Well, it can't. You know, the firm can't go under because then you would have unemployed workers and whatnot. So I think we found that after the initial stages, these systems have actually become incredibly inefficient. Now, I spent a lot of my time, you know, in the global South, and my family's from the Caribbean. So, you know, I've been to both, you know, I've been to places like Jamaica, and I've also been to places like Cuba. And often you'd be like, well, there's no mass homelessness in Cuba. So I think at the very least, you could say that you could probably get central planning to the point that it could afford people the basic minimums of a decent life. But I think it hasn't proved efficient in a way that we could convince anyone in the advanced capitalist world they should transition to this system. And I think there is a role for market mechanisms for both solving questions, problems of economic calculation, but also incentive issues.
Thank you.
Just a quick answer to that question for me was that how do I feel about this equality? I think in terms of some of the most successful companies of the planet at the moment, Facebook, Google, Amazon, Apple, well, except for Steve Jobs, like their founders are still alive, and they started their companies without any significant capital. So I think the possibility of starting your company is very real, and you can within one generation create incredible wealth within the capitalist society without any kind of starting capital.
Why is almost everyone a wage earner then?
Well, not everyone is a successful entrepreneur, but there's a possibility of doing that. And then in terms of like who actually benefits from the kind of older capital, in terms of the retirement pension plans in Finland, the pension system holds an equity of over 100 billion euros, and every single Finnish wage worker has a stake in that pension system. So there is a feedback loop in the Finnish Nordic model that also the workers get to benefit out of the equity returns of the system.
Thank you. Thank you for the vote. Let's give them thanks. So let's have our second debate. In this debate we will have Juhana Vartiainen, and we will have Matt Bruenig. And again, you may shortly introduce yourselves. And Matt, you may begin as our foreign speaker.
My name is Matt Bruenig. I work for a think tank called People's Policy Project in the U.S. It's a crowd-funded socialist think tank. Prior to starting that think tank a couple of years ago, I worked as a bureaucrat, union law bureaucrat in the U.S., and I also worked for several labor unions.
Thank you.
Juhana Vartiainen, MP for the National Coalition Party, Kokoomus, and economist. And I would call myself as a social liberal in the sense that I believe that the welfare state and the liberal market economy need each other. So it's a symbiotic relationship. The market economy provides the resources for the welfare state, but the welfare state really makes capitalism work better. It educates us, it's a kind of coach, and as they talked in this, as I said in this fine discussion, it sort of improves the bargaining position of everybody. It facilitates social change, since when you have social security, then it's less disruptive. If you lose your job, you can move on. So my slogan would be more market economy and more welfare state. They are not enemies.
Thank you. In this debate, we will talk about the pros and cons of the Nordic welfare model and more market-based regimes, as you already touched in your intros. So the question is, which Juhana will answer first, what is the optimal way of organizing social services and healthcare, and why?
Well, the pragmatic, the non-dogmatic answer to this is we don't know really, and the important thing is to see to it that to make sure that these basic vital services are available to everybody, and then let us just try to learn. And that's, I guess, is the modern Nordic approach, that you create institutions where you can sort of experiment on whether it's better to outsource the production of, say, medical services or schools, or to keep them sort of in-house in the public sector. And when I look at Sweden, where I worked as a civil servant for 13 years, then there's a lot of experimenting going on. They sort of outsource part of the medical system. Then they outsource also, they gave room for private schools. Now that latter one seems to work less well, so they are sort of coming back. And I guess that would be the intelligent approach, not to sort of pretend that we would in advance know the answer.
Yeah, I actually somewhat agree with the empirical approach on this, but I think the empirics in certain sectors are pretty clear that with health and education specifically, that publicly organized production tend to be more effective. In the U.S., of course, we have one of the most private healthcare systems in the world, and we end up spending about 17% of our GDP on healthcare, whereas in Finland it's 9% of GDP. Yet we fail to cover 12% of our people. Even people who have insurance, 23% of them say that they have foregone medical treatment in the last year because they couldn't afford it. So you cover everyone, and everyone seems to be able to afford to go to the doctor for about half the price relative to the size of the economy. With education, I think, yeah, I mean, as you admit, in Sweden, they went to a more voucherized approach, and it seemed to have had a lot of problems, including increasing discrimination, or not discrimination, but sort of self-segregation of different groups, which is not socially optimal. So for things we usually call social services, I think one of the reasons we call them social services is because over time, most governments have incorporated them as being directly produced, and the reason they have done that, I think, is because as an empirical matter, that's proven to be quite effective.
Yeah, I mean, just a short comment on that. I guess the United States is still a kind of outlier in this organization of the health sector, and it is true that the sort of the health outcome of the U.S. population is rather poor when you relate it to the resources that have been used. But that would not imply that it is always best to organize all production of health services sort of within the public sector. There's a lot of economic studies that suggest that, for example, some private hospitals in the UK work better than public hospitals, and so you have to be sort of pragmatic and case by case. And anyway, there are many sort of, it's more granular in the sense that you might have a public hospital, but still the ambulance emergency service might work better when it's also bought from the private provider. So I would advocate pragmatism.
Matt, do you wish to comment shortly?
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to how you want to organize the specific production, whether you want to do it directly in-house, or if you want to do it through a state-owned enterprise where there's a little bit more of an arm's length, or if you want to do it through what we might think of as a conventional private provider, though in my preference I would have those private providers owned through pension funds or through wage earner funds. That's sort of my approach, unlike the co-op approach of Bhaskar. Which of those kind of three approaches you take to managing and delivering is to me like an empirical question. But the key for me in all of them is, you know, pick the right slot and also make sure all slots are ultimately socially owned.
Thank you. Let's move on to the next question. Can the state take a direct role in production of goods through, for instance, state-owned enterprises? And Matt, you will begin this one.
Yeah, I mean, again, we're going to go into the empirical aspects of it. Of course, there are a lot of effective state-owned enterprises in Nordic countries. You've got Equinor in Norway, and Statkraft, and you've got Finnair, and you've got SAS, and you've got Norsk Hydro, and you know, there's something like, what, 40 or 50 state-owned enterprises in Finland, if you include the companies Solidium owns. You know, I mean, those companies seem to be pretty effective. They produce dividends for the state. So, you know, I haven't, certainly state-owned enterprises can be run badly, but they can also be run well. And I think the Nordic experience has generally been that they are run well. On average, they produce reasonable dividend yields relative to, you know, revenue and that sort of thing, and are pretty effective.
Again, I would say that these state-owned, partly or majority state-owned companies are mostly run well, and then they are run rather as if they were private or privately owned companies. There are some studies in the discipline of finance that suggest that in the sort of, it's not clear-cut, but on the average, companies and assets that are owned and run by private investors, they tend to better to increase in value in the long run. So, but I would again take a pragmatic approach. I don't see why one should specifically push for state ownership if there are no specific sort of reasons for it. I can sort of understand that perhaps a company like Patria, which sells military equipment to the Finnish state, it's perhaps good that it's in state hands, but otherwise there is not much in the economic empirical literature that would suggest that one should specifically try to increase state ownership in the economy.
Well, so partially it's going to depend on your goal here. So yeah, it's certainly the case that in a lot of instances, private companies can be as effective in some of those state-owned roles. But the benefit of having them state-owned, if they're at least as effective at producing the good efficiently, is that you get the full dividend yield, right? And so if we're here to say we want to build the economy to make it maximally supportive of the welfare state, then getting to capture the whole dividend yield instead of a small percentage, and an ever a smaller percentage as corporate tax rates keep getting cut, that's not a really effective way to bring in revenue for the welfare state. So I think you have to consider the dividend yield as a really big benefit. And then the second thing I would say is, yeah, I mean, generally, right, the state-owned enterprise portfolio, they have strategic considerations, right? So you have the military contractor owned by the state. In the United States, we have private military contractors, and it's a very wasteful process. And you might also have other strategic sectors where it's really important to maintain headquarters in the state, right? So you might have your telecom companies. I think Finland owns at least a significant percentage of what is it, Elisa and other telecoms. You have Telenor. You have natural monopolies like the railways. Like there are good reasons for those kinds of companies. And if you look cross country, the state-owned enterprises, the kinds of enterprises that end up state-owned are also end up being very consistent, right? Finland owns Finnair, Norway and Sweden owns SAS. Finland owns VR, Norway owns Norway State Railways, right? There's a logic to owning those kinds of enterprises, which is why I think they keep popping up in country after country.
Two short remarks on that. First, I mean, we should perhaps not dwell on this at length, but I guess there is a logical flaw in this dividend argument, since basic economics would suggest that then if there is a flow of dividends, you might as well sell it to the stock market and you would get precisely the price which which is the same as the present value of the flow of dividends. The other remark is that, and that was something that was already suggested by Mikko Kiesiläinen, is that these state-owned companies tend to become subject to political pressure, and sometimes this is just not good for economic efficiency. I mean, there might be a political pressure for a state-owned company to go on producing, say in a remote region in Finland, to go on producing unprofitably, and then because it's so difficult for politicians to destroy jobs, and in the long run it would anyway be better just to let the market mechanism do its sort of job there, and then, which is the Swedish approach, to re-educate these people and help them move to other places in Sweden. And this is something that's very important in Swedish social democracy. They have always loved sort of disruption and structural change. The idea in Sweden is that if a plant closes down, well, then it really closes down, and people are encouraged to move. They get some subsidies to that. They might be re-educated, but Sweden loves change, which is sort of driven by market forces.
I think, I mean, and we just went over this argument with Bhaskar, but the idea that the state will not care if there are massive job losses if it doesn't happen to own the firm is just seems wrong, right? I mean, the reason they don't want the jobs lost is because they care about those workers and those workers as voters, and those workers are going to feel the same pain whether it's state-owned or not. And in fact, you now have another constituency when it's privately owned, which are the owners, and they're going to feel pain, and you got to worry about them now as well. So the pain of losing a productive unit is basically the same whether it's state-owned or not. And you see even in the United States, right? When General Motors went bankrupt, the United States temporarily nationalized it. When the financial sector went bankrupt, the United States temporarily nationalized it. Even in Sweden, when they had their crisis in the 90s, they temporarily nationalized a lot of the banks. So the fact that they're nominally privately held clearly doesn't stop the state from stepping in to save jobs and to save sectors. Like, I think that argument is just not really valid in light of our historical experience.
As a shareholder, surely from the point of view of the shareholder, they would want to get rid of a loss-making unit, and that's the positive force in capitalism, because that is what in the long run raises our living standards.
Okay, let's move on. Excuse me. Do you think it makes sense to distinguish between the provider and producer? Should private profit-seeking companies be allowed to produce healthcare services and run retirement homes or service housing for the disabled, if the funding comes mainly from public source and the minimum conditions and services are regulated? Why? And I think it's Matt's time to begin.
Well, we'll return back to our
it's the same question every time.
Case-by-case situation. I mean, so there are some unique considerations with government contracting. I think there's a naive assumption in a lot of cases that, well, the private producer, that they're more efficient because they're privately organized, whereas a state producer is less efficient, is more prone to corruption and that sort of thing. But that ignores the unique situation of the state buying from that producer, and that relationship is itself very, very prone to corruption. And so I was mentioning earlier, the military producers in the United States are famously a corrupt situation where you have companies like Raytheon and Lockheed Martin that charge ridiculous amounts of money to build planes that often don't even work. And that's not a function of, or I should say, that these are privately owned companies, but that nexus of a contractual relationship with the state invites all the same problems that are supposed to exist in an integrated state-owned unit, where you also, employ and directly own the productive unit instead of contract from it.
Well. I mean, we keep coming back to this question. Let me just say that if the system is corrupt, then you can either have a corrupt relationship between this organizer and the private producer. And if that's corrupt, then the outcome will be bad. But even in the sort of in-house production, you might just be very inefficient or corrupt, and that is why I am advocating this case-by-case approach. For example, in healthcare or social services, you can also argue that in some Finnish municipalities, for example, they want to protect their own municipal jobs, whereas they could, in fact, increase efficiency and save taxpayers' money, that is people's money, by just outsourcing some of these services. We know, for example, in mergers of municipalities, there was a very stupid law voted by the parliament. I did not sit there yet. That said that when municipalities are merged, then nobody will from the administration will get fired for 5 years, and that created a huge amount of completely unnecessary bureaucrats. So the public sector is not sort of can be very inefficient, and so can this outsourcing if there is corruption. So you should really sort of be pragmatic and try to improve things.
And one thing I will say beyond the point about corruption in the contracting process is, for especially some of these social services, the things that are often done, since we know reasonably well how to do them publicly, you're kind of swimming against the tide to try to outsource them, because when you do outsource them, you at minimum are going to have to be paying a profit margin on top of the costs that it requires to produce the service. So they've got to be so efficient that they can cut costs even below the fact that they're now having to charge a margin. But when you take services like education, for instance, where we know pretty well how to do it, and it is very hard to increase efficiency, because the way you increase efficiency is to increase the number of students each teacher has to take care of, which also degrades the educational service. When you have a lot of these labor-intensive social services situations, it's very hard to actually increase efficiencies, because they're just very labor-intensive. And for instance, another way in the healthcare service, and I've run into this because I used to work for a healthcare union, is private companies will try to increase efficiencies by having one nurse take care of 10 patients instead of 5. But of course, that then invites all sorts of problems where they're unable to care for all of them. So like there are certain ratios of nurses to patients that make sense, and certain ratios of teachers to students that make sense, and it's very hard to get above those ratios and become more efficient. So outsourcing means you're now paying a margin for what really is not going to be more efficient services. And so, for, like I said, for certain kinds of things, it's very hard to imagine that that's going to be like net beneficial to public finances.
Well, there is something in that argument, and I mean, if the job of the nurse is to try to soothe a dying patient, you cannot be sort of, if you hold the patient's hand, you cannot sort of improve your speed in that sense, like Cosmo Soininvaara says. So there is something in that argument, but that's not the entire story. Then the private sector, on the other hand, is very good at innovating, and there is this incentive for innovating and increasing productivity, and that is good. And when you think of the health sector, which is surely alongside tourism, it is perhaps in globally and in Europe, it is certainly a growth sector. The entire Europe will get old. This aging problem will create a huge demand for health services, and many of them will just benefit hugely from innovations. I don't know what they might be. They might be some logistical sort of programming, or a sort of nursing robot, or remote operations, and whatever. But still, I mean, I buy that argument, but we also want to harness the innovative incentives of private entrepreneurship. So, and that's, again, I come back to this, let's be pragmatic and try to sort of get the best out of both worlds.
Let's move on to our last question, and then we will take some questions from the audience. For the last question, we're talking about trade unions. I know Juhana has many opinions on that, and you will begin. What do you consider to be the role of trade unions in sustaining the Nordic model?
Well, I think it is huge, and trade unions are the most important popular movement in Scandinavia. They have really made these countries what they are. So I wish them well. And then you were perhaps referring to the fact that I guess in Finland there is too much of their power has been entrenched in legislation, whereas I'm more for the Swedish approach, where the unions want to stay at arm's length from the state, and they think that they can advance the interests of their members without enshrining their contracts in legislation. But by and large, I really hope that unions will thrive and succeed. But for their own good and for society's good, I think I would say they have got a little bit too much power in this country. Not so in the other Scandinavian countries.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're key to a number of the egalitarian elements. The solidaristic wage setting, which keeps wage levels relatively compressed, is something that appears to only occur in these sectoral bargaining situations. And then, of course, the political components of them being able to fund, whether it's SDP or other sort of worker-friendly parties, has been key to the development of these states as well. So they form obviously a crucial political and also economic role in the organizing of the labor market. And then I would also say, as a socialist, that I think that labor unions and as well as co-determination, meaning that workers get to be appointed to some of the seats on the board of directors, that's the key element of making sure workers have representation in the workplace. And then on top of having the state own, whether it's the equity in a kind of hands-off fashion or direct public services, like those are the two things that I think are key to creating like a robust socialist system, is sort of state ownership and then trade unions with co-determination.
Do you wish to comment?
Well, I mean, I don't know whether I would call this a socialist system, but basically I am for worker representation in company boards. It seems to work quite well in Germany and Sweden, and the sort of company owners and leaders in countries like Sweden, they were reluctant at first, but then they understand that once this ombudsman labor representative sits in the board, they get the same information. They sort of they better understand the economic environment and the constraints. They go back to their colleagues and they say, well, we should perhaps sort of be moderate with our wage demand. So I guess it has worked quite well. And in fact, in our governmental program, we have there a paragraph that says that we would like to improve the company personnel's sort of bargaining position within the company, and then we would want to give more sort of bargaining, a larger bargaining mandate to the workplace. But that was unfortunately rejected by the employers' organization and the unions when they concluded this huge wage pact, this competitiveness pact. So I'm more for this.
Do you wish to have the last comment, Matt? You can, if you will.
Well, so let me just clarify a little bit sort of my overall perspective, since we didn't get entirely into like where's the socialism component of it. But so for me, I believe in social ownership of the means of production, and the way that I want to accomplish that is you'll have a general government sector, health, education, that is very conventional, and that's government owned and government produced, and then you have a state-owned enterprise sector, which exists already, obviously to some degree in Finland and Norway and in Sweden, and then you have this third sector, which is very much like what the Meidner plan in Sweden was after, where you have for every other company in which there's not there's no real point in bringing them under general government or state-owned enterprise status, you want to have those owned by a fund. I call it a social wealth fund in the U.S. They're pushing that now under Corbyn in the UK to some degree, and so that's kind of how you get the socialist level. But I think we kind of agreed that which of those three you want to slot any given unit of production in is kind of open and up for grabs depending on what proves to be most effective.
Thank you. Let's go to the questions from the audience. And as you were wanted a question last time, you will get the first question. There's also, I see you. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Tero Vekroth. I have one comment and then a question. Firstly, on this, there's a lot of mentioning of the U.S. healthcare system as some kind of a capitalist hell with, and I would agree it works pretty badly for most of the people. But I just want to point out, actually, I know quite a lot of the topic, and the earlier U.S. system definitely was not market-driven completely. It might have been capitalist, like, for instance, and I'm not talking about Obamacare now, but before, the federal government was explicitly forbidden of bargaining on the drug prices, which is just insane. If you are the biggest buyer, of course you should use your power to negotiate the prices down. So this might go to the earlier discussion about the corruption there or something, I don't know, but definitely market mechanism was lacking, and quite weirdly left in the US, Obamacare seems to be introducing a bit more market mechanism there. So perhaps a comment on that later. The second question is, or the real question actually, mainly for Matt, is particularly in Finnish context, don't you think that union power at extremis actually is in conflict with democracy? Because here we live in parliamentary democracy, and we accept that democratically elected people like Juhana, they make laws and then we all need to follow them. We have effectively now outsourced part of our common rules to a unelected, undemocratic corporate system like unions here. So just like to get your comment on that. Do you think it can be taken too far?
Yeah, so on the U.S., it's the case that the U.S. Medicare system, which and Medicaid system, Medicare is for old people and Medicaid for poor people, are not allowed to negotiate drug prices, which goes into the point about outsourcing purchasing to private providers is not necessarily effective or efficient. The rationale they actually give for that is that they want to reflect the market. Like, we'll just take whatever the price is given right now instead of be like our own actor. But of course, drug prices in the United States are among the highest in the world, and so it doesn't really make sense. As to the last point, I think it's an interesting point because it actually kind of bleeds into the capitalist critique as well, because what the socialists would say is, don't you think it's undemocratic that we have this elected state, but in addition to this elected state making decisions about how the country should run, we also have this class of capitalists who make quite significant decisions about how the society is going to be run, since they own most of the productive units of society. So it seems like at minimum, you know, if you're trying to come from the more capitalist-leaning side of things, you would make an allowance for the idea that yes, the state has some power to govern the country, but then so do unions, and maybe from the capitalist perspective, so do employers and employer organizations, right? That's the what is it called? The sort of tripartite system, right? So you know, my ultimate view is that is you would just have state and unions. And you wouldn't have the employer level, because the employer would be state-owned across the board, whether through a fund, a state-owned enterprise, or general government.
The tripartite system, though, has created quite a high unemployment rate in this country. That is something we should not forget.
Well, I should add that if you don't look at unemployment rates, but you look at employment rates, the employment rates in the Nordic countries at prime age, between age 25 and 54, are higher than the U.S., and that's driven by all sorts of factors.
Yes, they are. So they are in Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. But in this country, the employment rate lags behind, and we have the highest unemployment rate in non-Mediterranean Europe. So this Finnish tripartite system is not working well, and that's why I'm trying to reform it.
Thank you. We have 2 questions. I will take 2 more questions, but please keep your questions short, and I will ask you to keep your answers short as well. Thank you.
Yeah, hi, I'm Petri Paas. My question is to Juhana. Talking earlier on the healthcare system, if I understood you correctly, you said that there's corruption in the Finnish healthcare system. Could you be more specific with that? What did you mean?
No, I did not say that, but in principle, I mean, we should not have blind faith in neither private or public production. That was my simple point. Blind faith leads to corruption.
Thank you. Then last question, and we will have afterwards, you can general remarks and questions, but for these 2 debaters, this is the last question.
Hello, I'm Saska Heino, I'm a PhD student here. I have a question on productivity and investment rates. We know from the European example and perhaps from the US that the general investment rate, whether it's private or public, has gone down for, let's say, over the period of 30 years or so. And productivity growth remains quite stagnant. In the Finnish case, it has remained so, and the year-on-year change in many European countries has even gone down. So the productivity growth is slowing down, whilst our population is growing older, and with this huge problem with energy production, transportation, housing, in keeping up with the climate requirements. So how either by public or private means do we increase productivity and investment rates and direct them so that we can tackle climate change? Thank you.
Short question, short answer, please.
I don't have a great answer to that. I mean, in general, I think productivity growth is mostly a function of innovation in a developed economy, and I don't think we have good innovation. I wouldn't say it's random, but it's hard to push a button and make more innovation happen. And so I don't think that really cuts one way or another, and public versus private or that sort of thing.
Well, I think that the public sector should concentrate on investments in human capital, education, research, where there are externalities, and then infrastructure. And then sort of mostly everything else should be left to the incentives of private investors. That having said that, the low productivity growth of the recent decade or 15 years or so is a major puzzle for us economists.
Thank you, our second debaters. Okay, we have still time for general questions. I think there was... Okay, you there.
Hey, my name is Ayak, and my question was about something that Juhana said. Someone already asked about it. You said something about the corruption of healthcare, something related to that. If I understood right, your point was that if there is a chance that there's corruption or something, you're not satisfied with the service of public healthcare in Finland, a person should be able to, that's the reason we should outsource public healthcare to the private sector. Isn't that not the case right now? If a person is not satisfied with dental care or whatnot, they can choose to go to the private sector.
Well, I'm not sure I used the word corruption there in that case, but basically, yes, freedom of choice is good, and that's mostly what we are trying to do in this reform of the health and social sector. That it's very difficult, but we try to sort of create a level playing field for public production units and private producers.
I'm not quite sure. I'm sorry. Does that not already exist? Like a consumer can choose between public and private. If they're not satisfied with the public, they can go to a private sector.
Well, to some extent, yes, but we now try to encompass a larger share of the privately produced medical services within the public system, so that it would be paid for by the state. So that instead, as it is now, if you are not satisfied with the services of a doctor in the public sector, you go to the private sector, but you must pay. And now we try to just to encompass even this private sector production within the public sector financing.
Thank you. We have the next question here.
All right, my comment was related to something that Mikko actually said. I'm not sure if Mikko is still present. I'm not noticing him, but yeah. If he's not present, then or in any other case, then somebody else can take a catch from this. Because at the end of the debate between Mikko and Bhaskar, Mikko said something about, took the example of Facebook, Google and all of these other information technology sector enterprises as something that has been like started by a few people and it has then grown. And this is kind of like often presented as an idea of like a free market operating by itself. But actually, when it comes to companies like Facebook, the intervention of the state at the very dire level actually has been present for the entire time of Facebook's growth. I mean, Facebook has been a part of the United States security intelligence apparatus in the way that it has contributed to its growth. The state has promoted Facebook, state has directly helped Facebook in its operations, and in return Facebook has operated as a kind of like intelligence gathering mechanism that also allows the American state to have an effective like means of gathering information. I mean, there's some pretty good information on all of this happening. So
do you have a question?
The question here is that why talk about these sort of examples of like private firms prospering when state intervention forms a crucial part of all capitalist firms growing, even at the level of like the whole corporate system is a state invention in a way. It's not a natural part of market. It's something that the state has invented in a way to advance the economy.
Thank you. Do we have someone who wishes to answer that question?
Just, I mean, my guess is that the many economic historians would contest the idea that this shareholder structure, a privately owned company where you can buy shares with limited liability, that I don't believe most historians would say it's a state invention. Of course, you need the legislative, you need a sort of rights-driven judicial system, but I guess it should be characterized as a private invention, and very effective at that. Adam Smith was very sort of suspicious of it.
We have many questions.
Thanks. I have a question for our American guests. I'm just wondering, how do you see the relationship between electoral politics and movements in terms of building democratic socialism in the U.S.?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that you have to. You have to, go to where the breakthrough is. So right now, it seems like we're making a lot of progress electorally. You can't really conjure movements out of nothing. I would say that in general, the discourse around social movements is very vague. It describes just about anything. You could get 100 people in the streets and get some like media attention, and people will call it a social movement. It can mean basically anything. So I don't think real mass social movements are few and far between. one movement that the left has been able to institute its gains and hasn't gone away is the labor movement. And I'm more interested right now in talking about how to revive the labor movement, how to bring broader struggles against sexism, against racism, into a broader current of a workers' movement that can actually institutionalize change and has the resources and leverage to actually create disruptions, rather than seeing them completely siloed. But the last thing I'll say is that the European left in particular has, for the last 15 years, kind of done an equation, or longer than that, 20 years, has it as a primary mode of politics the idea of we're going to do electoral campaigns plus social movements, and that's going to equal power. But it's managed to do very little compared to what it did in the previous century, when it placed the linchpin of its strategy, trade unions and mass parties. So I think we need to try to recreate that formula while bringing in other new dynamic struggles and every struggle against oppression, of course, into that framework.
Matt, do you wish to comment? Okay. Then we will take two last questions that I've seen. There and there. Yes.
My question is primarily for the right-wingers in the room, or the Finnish people. I don't know if I should describe you as right-wing. It's about the dynamism in Swedish society and its relationship to the recent rise of the Sweden Democrats, which I find very worrisome, and the rise of right-wing autocrats in general. And you look at the States and that has happened. How do you defend the basic principles of liberal organization in society against such forces? What's the picture you give to people that's better than the right-wing demagogues that are coming into our democracies?
Yes.
Well, that's what I'm trying to do, but I must confess, I am a pretty pessimistic and frustrated and disappointed about these developments in countries like Sweden and Germany, where by and large economic and social policy have worked fairly well. I mean, in these countries have lower unemployment rates than what we have. Sweden in 10 years ago carried out reforms that increased the employment rate, and there's a lot of quite successful work-based immigration in Sweden. The unemployment rate of immigrants are lower than in this country, but in spite of all these positive characteristics, then these nationalistic populists seem to gain both political strength, and I mean, I don't have the answer yet, but that's all my political work is concerned with this. In fact, this is one of the reasons why I went into politics. I am concerned and I am worried about this, how the European judicial and legalistic order is challenged by populistic nationalism, and I really believe in the liberal market economy, democracy, social market economy, and what we see in many countries is more political support, more political strength at the extremes. So I'm very concerned about this. We might repeat this discussion in a couple of years and see how things are gone. But you take up the issue that keeps me awake at night.
Then the last question. Do you have the microphone? Yes.
I do.
Good.
Thank you. I have actually a comment and also a question for Juhana Vartiainen about the innovation in Finnish healthcare. In Finnish healthcare, if we expected, or you expect perhaps, that there will be more innovation in healthcare if it's privatized. Okay, so I would say that more than robotic receptionist or something like that, the point would be to get treatment to various medical conditions, right? And but in Finland, the system is very much controlled by the national healthcare guidelines, which käypähoitosuositukset for the Finnish speakers, which also include like diagnostic codes and diagnostics and certain criteria, and then what kind of treatment and medication are you allowed to get within the system. It's like and also your social security status in certain diseases or injuries. And quite often, at the moment, in many areas, for instance, the austerity has hit this system, that you cannot create new recommendations at the moment. This is what I've heard from medical seminars. And also, and then you have like let's say you have a problem with your hand or your leg, and you can have something like 4 different diagnostics that you can give, and otherwise it's unspecified pain. And okay, let's say that we have this privatized system. At the moment, you will make some kind of a deal with a private producer of the health service. And at the moment we have this tendency that we have this huge centralized decisions about certain instruments, for instance, assisted instruments, and you are only allowed to provide them in specific criteria, even if they would help a certain patient, and even if these national healthcare guidelines, diagnostic codes do not apply to you, you don't get the help. And then if you, okay, let's say we have a private provider. Anyway, when you make this deal about what you have to, what kind of healthcare do you have to provide in certain situations with the public money, this is the kind of innovation that I would like to see, that we can also step out of the iron cage of these national healthcare guidelines, which are in place with the principle that, okay, we will have a control on the costs, etc., etc. But for instance, at the moment, usually public sector doctors can't even give a diagnosis which is not in this Finnish sort of with small cut of all healthcare knowledge and also scientific research. There can be 2 decades of research on certain issues, but it still does. This research still doesn't go to the harbor of Finnish national healthcare guidelines. So now you have the deal. Why would Mehiläinen, or let's call Perriäinen if you want to anonymize, so why would they give you a treatment which they are not obliged to give, or why would you have the benefits or enjoy the fruits of medical research unless you really have to give them? This is, I think, usual in the public-private partnerships. You provide what you have to provide without getting a breach of contract.
Thank you.
And long physical therapies, neurological therapies, etc.
Well, you are certainly much better informed on this issue than I am. Let me just say that you seem to plead for a sort of less heavily regulated system, and perhaps it's a naive hope, but somehow I would like to believe that this freedom of choice for the consumer of these services would go in the right direction here. And then, if there is competition between these providers, then the incentive to provide some sophisticated operation would be there, if that creates a reputation of doing these operations well and the ability to attract more customers. But then this idea of fostering competition, fostering innovations, I think it's more general than just within our national confines. I mean, if we had more private producers like Sweden has had for a long time, then we might have some Finnish attenders that would just produce these operations all over Europe. So I see this as an export sector really in the future, and that's why I think it's a good idea to try to increase the scope for privately produced health services. But you seem to be a much better expert than I am in these issues, so let me not just finish there. Thanks.
Thank you. This was our discussion tonight. I think we've seen a lot of lively debate, but also much more agreement than we were expecting to. And thank you for all your questions and coming here. It was so nice to see so many people. Thanks especially to our guests. Our Finnish guest, I think the other one has already unfortunately had to leave. And also our international guest, a special thank you for coming all the way here to Finland. Thank you everyone who made this event happen. Have a good weekend.